Hey guys, tonight we begin with the story of the 1919 Black Sox scandal. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There are certain moments in history that feel suspended in amber, crystallized not just in fact, but in feeling. Moments that carry within them the weight of entire worlds shifting, where the very air seems thick with consequence. The autumn of 1919 was one such moment, when the crack of a bat against horsehide carried echoes that would reverberate through the corridors of American mythology for generations to come. Picture, if you will, Chicago in those dying days of October. The city breathes with the rhythm of industry, steel mills painting the horizon in shades of amber and rust. The elevated trains threading their way through neighborhoods where immigrant dreams mingle with native ambitions. The Great War has ended, and America is stretching into its newfound confidence, flexing muscles it didn't know it possessed. Yet, in its very darkness, the Black Sox scandal illuminates something essential about the American character: our capacity for both corruption and redemption, our ability to face uncomfortable truths and emerge, if not unscathed, then at least wiser for the experience. The children who wept upon hearing of their hero's betrayal would grow into adults capable of loving the game while understanding its human limitations. They would cheer new heroes with eyes opened by experience. Their appreciation deepened rather than diminished by knowledge of sport's essential humanity. This generation would understand that perfection is not required for greatness, that the capacity for failure makes achievement more rather than less meaningful. The game itself, having survived its greatest crisis of faith, would develop new traditions and new heroes. Babe Ruth, arriving on the scene just as the scandal was breaking, would provide the kind of larger-than-life presence that helped restore faith in baseball's capacity for wonder. His home runs, soaring through the autumn air like prayers made manifest, would remind fans why they fell in love with the game in the first place. But even Ruth's magnificence carries within it the shadow of the scandal that preceded it. His every achievement is measured not just against the records of the past, but against the knowledge that those records might have been different had 8 men made different choices in hotel rooms and back alleys during that cursed autumn of 1919. The White Sox organization itself would endure decades of failure that seemed like cosmic punishment for the sins of 1919. The curse of the Black Sox would become as real as any supernatural force, manifesting in ground balls that found holes, pop flies that fell between fielders, and rallies that died just short of completion. Whether this pattern represented divine justice or mere statistical variance mattered less than the narrative it provided, a story of consequences that extended far beyond the lives of individual actors. Comiskey Park, the cathedral where the conspiracy was consummated, would stand for decades as a monument to both baseball's glory and its capacity for corruption. Fans would file through its turnstiles, carrying with them the knowledge of what had occurred within its walls, each game a small act of faith in the possibility that sport might transcend its human limitations. The field itself, that carefully manicured rectangle of grass and dirt, would witness thousands of games in the decades following the scandal, each one a small affirmation that the game could continue despite the knowledge of what had been lost. The same distances between bases that had been corrupted by human greed would also host moments of pure athletic beauty, reminding all who watched that the capacity for transcendence exists alongside the potential for failure. In the press boxes that ring the field, writers would continue to document the game's ongoing story, their eyes now trained to look for signs of corruption as well as evidence of excellence. The innocence that had allowed the 1919 fix to proceed undetected would be replaced by a skepticism that, while necessary, would add its own burden to the coverage of sport. Every unusual play would be scrutinized, every statistical anomaly investigated, every relationship between players and gamblers examined. This heightened vigilance would prevent future scandals of similar magnitude, yet it would also create an atmosphere in which suspicion became a constant companion to admiration. The writers who had once celebrated athletes as unblemished heroes would now approach them as complex human beings, capable of both greatness and failure, creating a more realistic but somehow sadder form of sports journalism. The fans, too, would change in response to the scandal. The absolute faith that had characterized their relationship with the game would be replaced by something more conditional, more aware of the potential for disappointment. They would still cheer with passion, still invest emotionally in outcomes, but they would do so with the knowledge that the object of their devotion was fundamentally human and therefore fundamentally flawed. This evolution in the fan experience would create its own form of tragedy. Children who should have been able to believe in heroes without reservation would instead grow up understanding that even heroes might betray the trust placed in them. The pure joy of athletic fandom would be forever complicated by awareness of the financial and personal pressures that might compromise the integrity of competition. Yet perhaps this loss of innocence, painful as it was, represented a form of growth. A culture that could acknowledge the capacity for corruption while still celebrating excellence might be more mature than one that required its heroes to be perfect. The America that emerged from the Black Sox scandal would be more skeptical but also more realistic, more aware of human limitations but also more appreciative of authentic achievement. The 8 band players would spend their remaining years as living reminders of the scandal's lessons. Their presence in American society, working ordinary jobs, living ordinary lives, would serve as constant testimony to the consequences of betrayed trust. They became, in their way, more powerful as cautionary tales than they had ever been as active players. Eddie Cicotte, pruning fruit trees on his Michigan farm, would embody the possibility of finding peace after failure. His hands, which had once crafted knuckleballs with artistic precision, would learn to coax life from soil and seed, finding in agriculture a form of redemption that professional sport could no longer provide. The same attention to detail that had made him a great pitcher would serve him well as a farmer, though the satisfaction he derived from a good harvest could never fully replace what he had lost. Joe Jackson, behind the counter of his dry cleaning establishment, would face daily interactions with people who knew his story but needed his services. These encounters would create moments of mutual humanity, opportunities for both judgment and forgiveness to manifest in the simple exchange of dirty clothes for clean ones. His customers would see in him both the hero he had been and the flawed human being he had proved to be, learning perhaps that these identities were not mutually exclusive. Buck Weaver's lifelong fight for reinstatement would become its own form of heroism, different from the athletic kind, but no less determined. His refusal to accept banishment would inspire some and frustrate others, yet it would serve as a reminder that the consequences of the scandal extended beyond those who actively participated in the corruption. His case would raise difficult questions about guilt by association and the standards by which we judge complicity in wrongdoing. The other conspirators would find their own ways of living with their choices, some in dignity and others in bitterness, but all of them carrying the weight of knowledge that cannot be unlearned. They would become characters in their own ongoing story, one that would continue long after their playing careers had ended and their names had been removed from official records. Arnold Rothstein's legacy would extend far beyond the single scandal he orchestrated, influencing the development of organized crime in America and serving as a model for future generations of sophisticated criminals. His understanding that information could be more valuable than violence, that corruption could be more profitable than crime, would reshape the underworld in ways that continue to resonate today. The legal system's struggle to address the scandal would contribute to the development of new frameworks for understanding white-collar crime and corruption. The difficulty of prosecuting actions that violated trust rather than specific statutes would lead to more sophisticated approaches to defining and punishing betrayal of public faith. Baseball's response to the crisis, embodied in the creation of the Commissioner's Office and the implementation of new oversight mechanisms, would become a model for how institutions might reform themselves in the face of scandal. The game's willingness to acknowledge its failures and take decisive action would serve as an example of how organizations might maintain legitimacy even after fundamental betrayal of trust. The lifetime bans imposed by Commissioner Landis would stand as perhaps the most severe punishment in the history of American sport. Yet they would also demonstrate the possibility of institutional redemption through decisive action. The men who were banned would serve as sacrifices to the larger good. Their careers ended so that the game itself might continue. The children who had idolized the Black Sox would grow into adults capable of more complex relationships with their heroes. They would teach their own children to love sport while understanding its limitations, to cheer achievement while remaining aware of the pressures that might compromise it. This transmission of both passion and skepticism would become one of the scandal's most lasting legacies. The ballparks where these children would take their own families would be filled with monuments to past greatness alongside reminders of past failures. The Hall of Fame would become a more selective institution, its standards elevated precisely because of the knowledge that admission represented not just achievement, but integrity. The absence of the banned Black Sox players would serve as permanent testimony to the standards by which greatness would be measured. The sporting press would develop new traditions of investigation and skepticism, understanding that their role extended beyond simple reporting of scores and statistics to include vigilant oversight of the game's integrity. The writers who had missed or ignored the signs of the 1919 conspiracy would be succeeded by journalists committed to asking difficult questions and investigating uncomfortable possibilities. The gambling industry would be forced to develop more sophisticated methods of operation, understanding that the kind of brazen manipulation that characterized the Black Sox fix would no longer be possible in a more vigilant environment. The relationship between sport and betting would become more complex, more regulated, yet also more honest about its fundamental interconnection. The 8 banned players would age and die carrying their secret knowledge with them, yet their story would live on as a permanent part of American mythology. Their names would be invoked whenever questions of integrity and corruption arose, not just in sport, but in politics, business, and any other arena where public trust might be betrayed. The fans who witnessed the 1919 World Series would carry their memories into old age, some maintaining until their deaths that they had seen something wrong, others insisting that they had noticed nothing unusual. These conflicting memories would become a part of the scandal's ongoing mythology, contributing to the sense that truth itself had been corrupted along with the games. The stadium where the games were played would eventually be demolished, yet the memory of what occurred there would survive in the collective consciousness of American sport. The new ballparks built in its place would be constructed with the knowledge of what had happened on the old site, creating a sense of historical continuity that acknowledged both achievement and failure. The documents generated by the investigation and trials would become historical artifacts, studied by scholars seeking to understand not just what happened, but how such betrayal was possible. The testimony of the players would be analyzed for insights into human motivation, institutional failure, and the pressure points where integrity might give way to corruption. The economic forces that contributed to the scandal would be studied and addressed, leading to better compensation for players and more equitable relationships between labor and management. The recognition that poverty and powerlessness created vulnerability to corruption would contribute to reforms that made such large-scale betrayal less likely in the future. The cultural impact of the scandal would extend into literature, film, and popular culture, with the story of the Black Sox becoming a touchstone for American discussions of innocence lost and trust betrayed. Each retelling would add new layers of meaning while preserving the essential tragedy of men who sacrificed greatness for temporary gain. The children who had been heartbroken by the scandal would eventually become grandparents themselves, sharing the story with new generations who would struggle to understand how such betrayal was possible. These conversations would become opportunities to discuss the complexity of human nature, the importance of integrity, and the cost of betraying trust. The game of baseball itself would survive and prosper, yet it would do so with permanent awareness of its vulnerability to corruption. Every suspicious play would be scrutinized, every unusual betting pattern investigated, every relationship between players and gamblers examined. This vigilance would prevent future scandals while creating an atmosphere in which paranoia and suspicion became constant companions to appreciation and wonder. And so, the story of the 1919 Chicago White Sox would become something larger than the sum of its parts. Not just a tale of athletic corruption, but a meditation on the nature of trust, the price of betrayal, and the possibility of redemption. It would serve as a reminder that even our most cherished institutions are ultimately human creations, subject to human failings, yet also capable of human greatness. In the end, perhaps the greatest legacy of the Black Sox scandal is not the corruption it revealed, but the resilience it demonstrated. The fact that baseball survived its greatest crisis of faith, that fans continued to believe despite having their trust betrayed, that new heroes emerged to replace those who had fallen. All of this speaks to something indestructible in the American spirit. The 8 men who chose corruption over integrity would be remembered not as villains, but as tragic figures. Men who possessed greatness yet chose smallness, who had the capacity for heroism yet settled for betrayal. Their story would serve as a permanent reminder that the choice between right and wrong exists in every moment. That character is defined not by our capabilities, but by our decisions. The autumn of 1919, which had begun with such promise and ended in such disgrace, would be remembered as the season when America grew up, when innocence gave way to wisdom, when the possibility of corruption became forever linked to the reality of achievement. It was the season when we learned that our heroes were human, and in learning that lesson, perhaps became more fully human ourselves. The crack of the bat still echoes through time, carrying with it all the weight of what was lost and all the hope of what might yet be found. In that sound lives the entire story of American sport, its capacity for both corruption and transcendence, its ability to break our hearts and restore our faith, its power to remind us that even in failure, even in betrayal, even in the deepest darkness of human weakness, the possibility of redemption remains. And so the game continues, played by new generations who know the story of 1919 yet still choose to believe in the possibility of something pure, something honest, something worthy of their faith. In their choice to believe despite the knowledge of betrayal lies perhaps the greatest victory of all, the triumph of hope over experience, of faith over cynicism, of the human capacity to love something larger than ourselves, even when we know it might break our hearts. The Black Sox scandal taught us that our heroes are human, but it also taught us that being human does not preclude heroism. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that greatness lies not in perfection, but in the courage to continue striving for it, even after we have seen how easily it can be lost. Beneath this surface confidence, something restless stirs, something hungry, something that will, in a matter of 9 innings, crack the very foundation of what we believed possible. The Chicago White Sox are kings of their domain. Not merely good, transcendent, they possess that particular magic that transforms a collection of individuals into something approaching mythology. Their ballpark, Comiskey Park, stands like a cathedral to the American pastime. Its grandstands filled with the faithful who speak in statistics and genuflect before heroes whose names ring like poetry. Eddie Cicotte, whose knuckleball dances through the air like autumn leaves caught in an unexpected wind. Joe Jackson, whose swing moves with the fluid grace of water finding its way downhill. Buck Weaver, whose glove work at third base defies the very laws of geometry. These men move through their world with the confidence of those who have mastered something essential. When they walk down Michigan Avenue, heads turn. Children follow in their wake like disciples. Bartenders slide drinks across mahogany bars with reverential nods. They are more than athletes. They are the living embodiment of American excellence, proof that talent and determination can elevate mere mortals to heights that touch the divine. But excellence, as it turns out, comes with its own particular burden. Charles Comiskey owns these gods, and like many who possess power over beauty, he wields it with the casual cruelty of the truly entitled. His players, despite their otherworldly abilities, exist within an economic structure that would make medieval serfs nod in recognition. They are bound to him by contracts that offer little more than sustenance, locked into service by a reserve clause that makes them property, as surely as if their names were etched on deeds. Imagine the particular indignity of being Eddie Cicotte, whose arm has crafted thousands of moments of pure artistry, yet who must plead for a bonus to help his family through the harsh Chicago winter. Picture Joe Jackson, whose bat has authored symphonies of sound and motion, counting coins in his modest apartment, while lesser men in tailored suits grow fat on the profits his talent generates. These men live in a world where their extraordinary gifts have made them famous, yet the fruits of that fame remain forever, just beyond their reach. The resentment builds slowly, like pressure in a steam engine. Not the explosive anger of a moment, but the deep, corrosive kind that eats away at the foundation of loyalty. They gather in hotel bars after games, these titans of the diamond, and speak in whispers about the unfairness of their situation. The conversations begin as mere venting, the natural complaints of working men against their employer. But as the season progresses, as Comiskey's parsimony becomes ever more apparent, those whispers take on a different tone. Into this atmosphere of discontent walks Arnold Rothstein, though he moves more like a shadow than a man. If Comiskey represents the old guard of American capitalism, brutal but somehow honest in its brutality, Rothstein embodies something newer, more sophisticated, and infinitely more dangerous. He understands that in the modern world, money is not merely currency but information, leverage, power itself. Rothstein sees the White Sox not as heroes or even as men, but as variables in an equation that he alone possesses the genius to solve. He recognizes that their very greatness makes them valuable in ways they cannot comprehend. A fixed World Series is not merely a corrupt act. It is a masterpiece of manipulation, a demonstration of the ultimate triumph of intelligence over innocence. The approach, when it comes, carries the subtle elegance of a spider's web. Not crude offers of cash thrown across a table, but carefully orchestrated conversations that feel almost accidental. A word dropped here, a suggestion there, all wrapped in the silk of understanding and sympathy. Rothstein's emissaries, men like Sport Sullivan and Abe Attell, are artists of their own dark craft, capable of making corruption feel like liberation, betrayal like justice. They find their most receptive audience in Chick Gandil, the team's first baseman, whose heart has been hardened by years of watching lesser men prosper while he struggles. Gandil becomes not merely a participant, but an evangelist, spreading the gospel of easy money to teammates whose defenses have been worn thin by disappointment and financial desperation. The conspiracy grows like a living thing, feeding on grievance and nourished by greed. Yet, even as it spreads, it remains something curiously fragile. These are not hardened criminals, but athletes, men whose lives have been structured around the pursuit of excellence, around the idea that effort and skill will be rewarded with victory. The very qualities that made them great at baseball make them poor at treachery. Consider Eddie Cicotte, perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire drama. He is a man of almost painful integrity, someone who has built his reputation on the precise, methodical excellence of his craft. His knuckleball is more than a pitch. It is an expression of his character, unpredictable yet somehow trustworthy, a thing of beauty born from countless hours of practice and refinement. Yet here he finds himself contemplating the ultimate betrayal of everything he has ever believed about the purity of competition. The money, when it finally comes, arrives with the weight of 30 pieces of silver. $10,000 in cash, more than Cicotte has ever seen at one time, yet somehow less substantial than he had imagined. It sits there in his hotel room like a malevolent presence, transforming the space from sanctuary to crime scene. He counts it with trembling fingers, each bill a small death of the man he used to be. But money, as it turns out, is the least of what he receives. Along with those crisp bills comes a knowledge that will poison every moment of joy he might have experienced for the rest of his life. He will never again feel the pure pleasure of a perfectly executed pitch, never again experience the innocent pride of a game well played. The money will disappear, spent on necessities, lost to time. But the knowledge will remain a permanent resident in the chambers of his heart. Joe Jackson presents perhaps an even more complex figure in this tapestry of corruption. Shoeless Joe, they call him, a nickname that speaks to his humble origins but also somehow to his essential innocence. He is a man of limited formal education, but possessed of an intuitive understanding of baseball that borders on the mystical. When he swings a bat, he communes with forces that mere mortals can only observe and wonder at. Yet Jackson finds himself swept up in events he cannot fully comprehend, making agreements he does not entirely understand. His participation in the conspiracy feels less like a choice than like a natural disaster. Inevitable, destructive, yet somehow beyond human agency. He will later claim confusion about his role, and there is something heartbreaking in his protestation, the cry of a simple man caught in machinery too complex for his understanding. Buck Weaver represents yet another variation on the theme of corrupted innocence. He knows of the fix. This cannot be denied. Yet he plays each game as if his life depends on it. His glove at third base continues to work its magic, turning impossible plays into routine outs. His bat continues to seek base hits with desperate hunger. He becomes a living embodiment of the contradiction at the heart of the entire affair. The impossibility of completely separating the man from the player, the corruption from the craft. The other conspirators, Happy Felsch, with his boyish grin now turned sinister, Swede Reisberg, whose very name sounds like a character from a morality play, Fred McMullen, and Claude Williams. Each carries his own particular burden of guilt and rationalization. They move through the days leading up to the World Series like actors rehearsing for a play they wish they had never auditioned for. And then there is Lefty Williams, the pitcher whose very nickname speaks to the casual intimacy with which America embraces its heroes. Williams possesses a fastball that seems to challenge the very laws of physics, yet he must now contemplate deliberately dulling its effectiveness. The mental gymnastics required are extraordinary, to be precisely bad enough to lose while not appearing obvious enough to be caught. As October 1919 approaches, Chicago pulses with anticipation. The city has wrapped itself in White Sox fever, and everywhere you look there are reminders of the coming World Series. Shop windows display jerseys and pennants, newspaper headlines scream with predictions of triumph, and conversations in streetcars and speakeasies revolve around batting averages and earned run averages with the intensity usually reserved for matters of life and death. The Cincinnati Reds, their opponents, are viewed with the benevolent condescension typically reserved for sacrificial lambs. They are a good team. No one denies this, but good in the way that a well-crafted piece of furniture is good. Serviceable, reliable, ultimately forgettable. They lack the mythic quality that elevates the White Sox above mere excellence into the realm of legend. Yet, within this atmosphere of confident expectation, there are those who sense something amiss. Sports writers, those professional observers of human nature, begin to notice subtle changes in behavior. The White Sox, typically loose and confident in the days before big games, seem tense, distracted. Their usual easy camaraderie has been replaced by something that feels forced, artificial. Hugh Fullerton, perhaps the most astute baseball writer of his generation, begins to ask questions that make people uncomfortable. He has covered enough games to recognize the difference between natural nervousness and something more troubling. His trained eye catches the small details that escape casual observation. The way certain players avoid eye contact, the forced quality of their laughter, the subtle but unmistakable signs of men carrying secrets too heavy for comfort. The conspiracy, meanwhile, begins to develop complications that its architects had not anticipated. The money that was supposed to flow smoothly from Rothstein's accounts becomes caught up in a web of intermediaries and double dealing. Promises made in smoke-filled rooms begin to feel less certain in the harsh light of day. The conspirators find themselves bound together not by mutual trust but by mutual fear, each man wondering whether his confederates might betray him before he has the chance to betray them. Sport Sullivan, one of Rothstein's key operatives, discovers that managing a group of conflicted ball players is considerably more complex than he had anticipated. These men are not professional criminals accustomed to the disciplines and loyalties of organized crime. They are athletes whose entire careers have been built on the foundation of competitive integrity, and asking them to suddenly embrace its opposite creates psychological tensions that threaten to tear the entire enterprise apart. The betting markets, meanwhile, begin to reflect a knowledge that seems to exist beyond the conspiracy itself. Money flows in patterns that suggest inside information. Yet the source of that information remains frustratingly elusive. The odds shift in ways that make professional gamblers nervous, creating ripple effects throughout the underground economy that supports illegal wagering. Rothstein himself begins to sense that his elegant plan may be developing flaws that could prove catastrophic. The very scope of the conspiracy that made it attractive, the fact that it involves not just one or two players but nearly half the team, also makes it vulnerable to exposure. Each additional conspirator represents another potential point of failure, another link in a chain that is only as strong as its weakest member. As the first game approaches, the psychological pressure on the conspirators becomes almost unbearable. These are men accustomed to performing under pressure, but the stress of athletic competition pales beside the weight of deliberate deception. They must not only lose, they must lose in a way that appears natural, inevitable, the result of superior play by their opponents rather than inferior play by themselves. Eddie Cicotte takes the mound for Game 1, carrying a burden that no pitcher should have to bear. The crowd erupts as he begins his warm-up tosses, their enthusiasm washing over him like a wave of affection and trust. These are his people, the fans who have cheered his every triumph and forgiven his occasional failures. They believe in him with the pure faith that Americans reserve for their sporting heroes, and he is about to repay that faith with betrayal. The first batter he faces is Maury Rath, Cincinnati's leadoff hitter, a competent but unspectacular player who represents exactly the kind of opponent that Cicotte has dominated throughout his career. Yet, as he winds up to deliver his first pitch, Cicotte faces a choice that will define not just the game, but the rest of his life. He can throw his best pitch, the knuckleball that has made him famous, or he can throw something else, something hittable, something that will begin the process of his own destruction. What happens next will be debated and analyzed for decades to come. Cicotte's first pitch strikes Rath squarely between the shoulder blades, not a wild pitch that got away, but a deliberate message, a signal to those who are watching for such things that the fix is indeed in. The crowd gasps at the unusual wildness from their normally precise pitcher, but they assume it is merely opening game jitters, the kind of small imperfection that makes the game human. But for those who know to look for it, that hit batsman represents something far more significant. It is the first crack in the foundation of American baseball's integrity, the first note in a symphony of corruption that will echo through the decades. Arnold Rothstein, watching from his private box, allows himself a small smile of satisfaction. The machine he has so carefully constructed is beginning to function exactly as designed. The game itself unfolds with the strange, dreamlike quality that characterizes all corrupted competitions. The Reds score early and often, taking advantage of opportunities that seem to materialize with suspicious frequency. Sicot, normally so precise with his location, finds his pitches drifting over the heart of the plate, at precisely the moments when such mistakes prove most costly. His fielders, typically sure-handed, develop a sudden case of butterfingers that allows easy plays to become adventures. Yet, even in the midst of this deliberate sabotage, there are moments when the pure love of competition threatens to overwhelm the conspiracy. Joe Jackson, despite his involvement in the fix, cannot help but swing with his natural aggression when he sees a pitch he likes. His bat connects with a sound that resonates through the stadium like a bell, sending the ball on a trajectory that speaks of nothing but honest effort. These moments of authentic competition, scattered throughout the game like flowers in a wasteland, serve only to make the overall deception more poignant. Buck Weaver, playing third base with his usual flair, creates several moments of cognitive dissonance that must confuse even the most astute observers. He dives for ground balls with genuine desperation, snares line drives with reflexes honed by thousands of hours of practice, turns double plays with the fluid grace that has made him famous. His play is so obviously genuine, so clearly the product of honest effort, that it creates a kind of ethical vertigo for those watching closely. The Cincinnati players, meanwhile, remain largely oblivious to the forces working in their favor. They know they are playing well, better perhaps than they have all season, but they attribute their success to the natural vagaries of competition rather than to any external assistance. Their joy in their unexpected dominance is pure and uncomplicated, which makes them inadvertent accomplices in their own exploitation. Ed Roush, Cincinnati's star outfielder, will later describe the strange feeling of everything going right, of every break falling in their favor, every bounce of the ball seeming to favor their cause. He interprets this as evidence of destiny, of their team finally receiving the recognition they deserve after years of playing in the shadow of more famous clubs. The possibility that their good fortune might have artificial origins never enters his mind. Game 2 brings a different pitcher, but the same corrupted dynamic. Lefty Williams takes the mound with the weight of expectation and conspiracy pressing down upon him like a physical force. The crowd, still confident despite the previous day's disappointing loss, greets him with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for conquering heroes. Their faith in him is absolute, their belief in his ability to even the series unshakable. Williams faces a challenge that is perhaps even more complex than Sicot's. Where Sicot could rely on his knuckleball to create natural unpredictability, Williams must deliberately diminish the effectiveness of a fastball that has been clocked among the fastest in the game. He must find ways to lose that appear natural while avoiding the kind of obvious failures that would immediately arouse suspicion. The psychological toll of this deception becomes evident in the small details of his performance. His usual confident demeanor on the mound gives way to something more tentative, more uncertain. The smooth rhythm that typically characterizes his delivery becomes slightly herky-jerky, as if some internal metronome has been knocked off its beat. These subtle changes, invisible to the casual observer but obvious to those who know him well, represent the visible manifestation of internal conflict. Hugh Fullerton, watching from the press box with the sharp eyes of a man who has seen thousands of games, begins to document these anomalies in his notebook. He cannot yet articulate what he is seeing, but his journalist's instincts tell him that something extraordinary is unfolding before his eyes. He starts to pay attention not just to what is happening on the field, but to the pattern of what is happening, the subtle rhythms of failure that seem too consistent to be entirely accidental. The game itself becomes a study in the corrupted sublime. There are moments of genuine beauty, spectacular catches, perfectly executed base running, pitches that showcase the highest levels of athletic artistry, interspersed with failures so perfectly timed that they seem almost choreographed. The overall effect is deeply unsettling, like watching a magnificent painting that has been deliberately damaged in strategic locations. As the series progresses, the psychological pressure on the conspirators continues to mount. Each game becomes not just an athletic contest, but a performance art piece of deception, requiring them to constantly calibrate their level of failure to avoid both success and detection. They must be bad enough to lose, but not so obviously bad as to raise immediate suspicions. Eddie Sicott finds himself caught in a particularly cruel bind during his second start of the series. The Cincinnati hitters, growing in confidence with each successful at-bat, begin to tee off on pitches that would normally handcuff them. Yet, even as he serves up these batting practice fastballs, part of his mind remains that of a competitor, analyzing the swings of opposing hitters, instinctively adjusting his approach to get them out. This internal conflict manifests itself in moments of almost surreal confusion, where Sicott will throw a perfect strike followed immediately by a pitch that seems designed to be hit hard. The Cincinnati players, riding the momentum of their unexpected success, begin to develop a swagger that, under normal circumstances, would irritate the competitive fire within him. Instead, he must swallow his pride and watch as lesser players treat him like batting practice. Joe Jackson's situation becomes perhaps the most psychologically complex of all the conspirators. His natural hitting ability is so extraordinary that even his attempts at failure often result in success. When he tries to swing weakly at a pitch, his muscle memory takes over and produces line drives. When he attempts to strike out, his eye is so good that he cannot help but lay off obvious balls, working himself into favorable counts almost despite himself. This creates moments of almost comic absurdity, where Jackson finds himself succeeding despite his best efforts to fail. His teammates, both those involved in the conspiracy and those who remain innocent, cannot understand his apparent distress at getting base hits. The crowd, naturally, celebrates each of his successes as evidence of his greatness, unaware that each celebration is a small torture for a man trying desperately to lose. Buck Weaver's continued excellent play becomes a source of increasing tension within the conspiracy. His refusal to alter his approach creates a kind of ethical anchor that threatens to drag the entire enterprise into the light. The other conspirators begin to pressure him to reduce his effort, to find ways to contribute to the losing cause, but Weaver seems constitutionally incapable of playing anything less than his absolute best. This dynamic creates fascinating subplots within the broader narrative of corruption. The conspirators find themselves arguing about strategy not just with their opponents, but among themselves, debating how much failure is enough, how obvious is too obvious, how to balance the demands of effective throwing with the need to avoid detection. Meanwhile, the innocent players on the team begin to sense that something is amiss. Ray Schalk, the team's catcher, grows increasingly frustrated with the performance of his pitchers, unable to understand why men who have dominated hitters all season suddenly seem incapable of throwing strikes when they need them most. His signals, normally followed with religious precision, begin to be ignored or altered in ways that make no strategic sense. Schalk's confusion deepens with each game. These are men he has worked with for years, pitchers whose every tendency he knows as well as his own. Yet now they seem like strangers, throwing pitches that contradict everything he knows about their capabilities and judgment. The cognitive dissonance becomes almost unbearable, creating a kind of professional vertigo that leaves him questioning his own understanding of the game he has played all his life. The innocent position players face their own particular torment. They play with desperate intensity, trying to compensate for the mysterious failures of their teammates, unaware that their efforts are being systematically undermined by those they trust most. Their honest effort provides a heartbreaking counterpoint to the deliberate mediocrity surrounding them, creating moments of almost tragic beauty amid the corruption. As the series reaches its climax, the various threads of deception begin to weave together into a pattern that even casual observers start to notice. The failures are becoming too consistent, too perfectly timed, too conveniently beneficial to Cincinnati's cause. What began as whispers in press boxes and hotel bars begins to grow into open speculation about the integrity of the competition. Arnold Rothstein, watching his creation unfold, begins to experience his own form of anxiety. The conspiracy he designed with such care is succeeding perhaps too well, creating patterns of failure so obvious that they threaten to expose the entire enterprise. He realizes that he may have underestimated both the difficulty of controlled failure and the perceptiveness of those who watch the game professionally. The betting markets, meanwhile, reflect a knowledge that extends far beyond the inner circle of conspirators. Money continues to flow in patterns that suggest widespread awareness of the fix, yet the source of this information remains mysterious. It becomes clear that the secret, if it ever was one, has leaked far beyond its original boundaries, creating a network of complicity that extends into areas that Rothstein never anticipated. Sport Sullivan finds himself managing not just 8 baseball players, but an entire ecosystem of corruption that seems to be developing its own momentum. The original simple transaction, money in exchange for deliberately poor play, has evolved into something far more complex and dangerous, involving layers of intermediaries, competing interests, and conflicting loyalties that threaten to tear the entire structure apart. The conspirators themselves begin to turn on each other as the pressure mounts. Accusations fly about who is not playing their part adequately, who might be ready to confess, who can be trusted, and who represents a danger to the group's continued secrecy. The bonds that once united them in common cause begin to dissolve under the acid of mutual suspicion and fear. Eddie Sicot, in particular, begins to crack under the psychological strain. The man who once carried himself with the quiet confidence of master craftsmen now moves through the world like a hunted animal, starting at unexpected sounds, reading betrayal into innocent glances, imagining exposure in every whispered conversation. The money he received, which once seemed like a fortune, now feels like evidence that will inevitably lead to his destruction. The final games of the series play out with an air of inevitable tragedy. The outcome is no longer in doubt. Cincinnati will win. The fix will succeed. The conspirators will collect their money. Yet the cost of this success becomes more apparent with each inning. What began as a simple transaction has evolved into something that will leave permanent scars on everyone it touches. Joe Jackson's final at-bats carry a poignancy that transcends mere sport. Here is a man whose entire identity has been built around his ability to hit a baseball, yet who must now deliberately diminish that ability in service to a cause he no longer fully understands or supports. Each swing becomes a small act of self-destruction, a conscious diminishment of the thing that has given his life meaning and purpose. The Cincinnati players, meanwhile, celebrate their impending victory with the uncomplicated joy of athletes who believe they have earned their success through superior skill and effort. Their happiness, pure and uncompounded by knowledge of the forces working in their favor, provides a sharp contrast to the misery of their opponents, who know that their failure is artificial but can do nothing to prevent it. As the final out is recorded, the White Sox dugout presents a study in contrasts. The innocent players sit in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how a team of their quality could have failed so completely. The conspirators, meanwhile, experience a complex mixture of relief at the successful completion of their task and dread at the consequences that may yet follow. The celebration in Cincinnati is loud and genuine, the joy of a city that has waited years to see their team reach the pinnacle of baseball success. Yet, even in their moment of triumph, there are those who notice the subdued reaction of the defeated White Sox, the lack of the fierce disappointment that typically characterizes competitors who have given their all only to come up short. Hugh Fullerton, his notebook now filled with observations and suspicions, begins the process that will eventually expose the entire conspiracy. He has documented patterns of play that defy statistical explanation, behavioral changes that suggest psychological distress, and betting patterns that indicate widespread knowledge of the series' outcome. Yet he knows that suspicion is not proof, and that the story he is contemplating will require evidence that may be impossible to obtain. The immediate aftermath of the series sees the conspirators scatter like thieves after a heist, each man retreating to his own private hell of guilt and fear. They collect their money, those who actually receive it, and attempt to resume their normal lives, yet they find that normalcy is no longer possible. They have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, committed an act that cannot be uncommitted. Eddie Sicot returns to his farm, carrying with him the knowledge that will poison every sunset, every morning coffee, every moment of what should have been peaceful retirement. The money sits in his account like a malevolent presence, earning interest yet somehow diminishing in value with each passing day. He has traded his integrity for financial security, yet he finds that security without honor is no security at all. Joe Jackson attempts to continue his career, but he finds that his natural ability has been corrupted by his consciousness of its potential for betrayal. Every successful at-bat now carries within it the memory of deliberate failure. Every cheer from the crowd a reminder of trust that has been violated. The game, that was once a source of pure joy, has become a complicated negotiation between his natural competitiveness and his knowledge of its fragility. Buck Weaver, perhaps the most tragic figure of all, discovers that knowledge without action carries its own particular punishment. He knew of the conspiracy but did not participate in its execution. Yet this partial innocence provides no protection from the consequences that will eventually follow. He has learned that in matters of corruption, mere awareness can be indistinguishable from complicity. The other conspirators each find their own way of dealing with the aftermath, yet none manages to escape the psychological consequences of their actions. They have discovered that betrayal, once committed, cannot be confined to a single moment or action, but spreads like a stain through every aspect of life, coloring every relationship, every achievement, every moment of what should have been innocent pleasure. Arnold Rothstein, meanwhile, surveys the wreckage of his creation with the detached satisfaction of a scientist whose experiment has produced the predicted results. He has demonstrated that even the most sacred aspects of American culture can be commodified and manipulated, that integrity itself has a price that can be calculated and paid. Yet even he begins to sense that the consequences of his success may extend beyond what he had anticipated. The secret, as secrets will, begins to leak into the wider world through 1,000 small channels. Bartenders who overheard conversations, hotel clerks who witnessed suspicious meetings, bookmakers who noticed unusual betting patterns. Each becomes a potential source of exposure, a thread that, if pulled, might unravel the entire conspiracy. Sports writers begin to ask questions that make team officials uncomfortable. Fans, initially willing to attribute the White Sox's poor performance to the natural unpredictability of athletic competition, begin to notice patterns that seem too consistent to be entirely accidental. The whisper campaign that will eventually destroy the conspirators begins as barely audible murmurs in the stands and press boxes. The 1920 season begins with the conspirators attempting to return to normalcy, yet they find that their secret has created invisible barriers between them and their teammates, their fans, and ultimately themselves. They play baseball, but it is a different game now, complicated by knowledge and corrupted by memory. Every victory feels hollow. Every failure carries the suggestion of deliberate intent. Eddie Cicotte attempts to recapture his previous form, yet he finds that the precise control that once defined his pitching has been compromised by psychological uncertainty. He no longer trusts his own instincts, no longer possesses the absolute confidence that excellence requires. His knuckleball, once a thing of beauty and precision, becomes erratic, unpredictable in ways that speak of internal chaos rather than artistic intention. The investigation, when it finally begins, carries with it the weight of national disillusionment. America in 1920 is a country struggling to define itself in the aftermath of global war, seeking heroes and certainties in an increasingly complex world. The possibility that even baseball, pure, innocent, essentially American baseball, might be corrupted strikes at the very heart of national identity. The grand jury proceedings that eventually expose the conspiracy read like a catalogue of human weakness and failed opportunity. One by one, the conspirators are called to testify, each man forced to confront publicly the choices he made in private moments of weakness or greed. Their confessions, when they come, carry the weight of genuine tragedy, the destruction of men who might, under different circumstances, have remained heroes. Eddie Cicotte's testimony, in particular, resonates with the power of classical tragedy. Here is a man of undeniable talent and essential decency, who allowed circumstances to lead him into betrayal, and who must now face the consequences of that betrayal before the entire nation. His words carry the weight of genuine remorse, yet remorse cannot undo the actions that created the need for it. Joe Jackson's famous plea, "Say it ain't so, Joe," whether real or apocryphal, captures something essential about America's relationship with its heroes. It expresses not just disappointment, but a kind of desperate hope that corruption might be explained away, that the heroes we need might yet prove worthy of our faith. The fact that Jackson cannot, in the end, say it ain't so, becomes a moment of national heartbreak. The trials that follow reveal the full scope of the conspiracy, while simultaneously demonstrating the difficulty of prosecuting crimes that exist more in the realm of ethics than law. The legal system, designed to deal with concrete actions rather than betrayed trust, struggles to find language adequate to the moral dimensions of what has occurred. The eventual acquittal of the conspirators on legal grounds provides no relief from the moral judgment that hangs over them like a permanent cloud. They are free men in the eyes of the law, yet they discover that freedom without reputation is a hollow gift, that exoneration without redemption provides no path back to the lives they once knew. Kennesaw Mountain Landis, baseball's first commissioner, understands that the game's survival depends on more than legal technicalities. His lifetime ban of the 8 conspirators represents not just punishment but a kind of ritual purification, an attempt to restore faith through the sacrifice of those who violated it. Yet even this decisive action cannot entirely erase the knowledge that corruption, once revealed, might exist anywhere. The aftermath of the Black Sox scandal extends far beyond the lives of the individual conspirators. It fundamentally alters America's relationship with its sporting heroes, introducing a skepticism that will never entirely disappear. The age of innocent hero worship ends, replaced by something more complex and ultimately more realistic, yet tinged with permanent sadness for what has been lost. Baseball itself survives, even prospers, yet it does so with the knowledge that its integrity requires constant vigilance, that the forces that corrupted the 1919 World Series remain present in every transaction, every negotiation, every moment when private interest conflicts with public trust. The game becomes more sophisticated in its defenses, more aware of its vulnerabilities, yet also somehow diminished by this necessary wisdom. The players who participated in the conspiracy spend the remainder of their lives carrying the weight of their actions. Some find redemption through acknowledgement and service. Others retreat into bitterness and denial, but none escapes the fundamental truth that certain choices cannot be undone. Certain trust cannot be restored. Eddie Sicot returns to his farm, where he tends crops with the same meticulous attention he once gave to his knuckleball. The soil, at least, does not judge him for past failures, and the seasons continue their ancient rhythm regardless of human betrayal. Yet even in this pastoral retreat, he carries within him the knowledge of what he has lost, not just his career, but his place in the American story he once helped to write. Joe Jackson opens a dry cleaning business, using hands that once caressed baseballs to press shirts and clean suits. The irony is not lost on him. A man who helped soil the national pastime now makes his living cleaning the garments of ordinary citizens. His customers treat him with a mixture of reverence for his past achievements and disappointment for his ultimate failure, creating a daily reminder of the complexity of his legacy. Buck Weaver fights his banishment until his death, maintaining his innocence with a passion that speaks to genuine belief in his own righteousness. His case becomes a symbol of the collateral damage that corruption creates, the innocent swept away with the guilty, knowledge treated as equivalent to action. His protests, however heartfelt, cannot penetrate the wall of suspicion that surrounds all who were present when trust was betrayed. The other conspirators fade into various forms of obscurity, some seeking anonymity as protection from their notoriety, others attempting to capitalize on their infamy in ways that only deepen their disgrace. They learn that there is no comfortable place in society for fallen heroes, no role that allows them to be fully human without being constantly reminded of their failure to be superhuman. Arnold Rothstein continues his career as a gambler and fixer until a bullet finds him in 1928, dying as he lived, in the shadows between legal and illegal, between genius and criminality. His murder remains officially unsolved, though it seems fitting that a man who lived by manipulating outcomes would meet an end that defied his ability to control circumstances. The 1919 World Series becomes a touchstone for American discussions of corruption and integrity, a shorthand reference that requires no explanation. Black Sox enters the language as a synonym for betrayal of trust, while the individual names of the conspirators become cautionary tales told to each new generation of athletes and citizens. The scandal's impact extends beyond sports into the broader culture, contributing to a more skeptical worldview that will characterize much of the 20th century. The innocent faith in institutions and heroes that characterized pre-war America gives way to a more complex understanding of human nature, one that acknowledges the potential for corruption even among those we most admire.